No one had shaken Ethan Cole's hand in 20 years, and if you worked on the 42nd floor, you learned that rule before you even learned where the coffee machine was. The glass doors of Cole Industries slid open with a whisper, revealing a boardroom wrapped in silence so thick it felt engineered, like everything else in Ethan's world, where the skyline of Manhattan stretched behind him in clean, untouchable lines, and a $2.3 billion contract sat waiting on polished walnut. Yet not a single person at that table dared step closer than 3 feet, not because it was written anywhere, but because they all knew, because they had all seen what happened when someone forgot, the subtle flinch, the cold retreat, the way Ethan's eyes would sharpen like steel being drawn, and today was no different as he lifted a sleek pen, signed his name in one smooth motion, and slid the contract back across the table without so much as brushing a fingertip against the other side. The investors exchanged glances, impressed, intimidated, slightly unsettled, and then, as expected, one of them instinctively extended a hand, a reflex born from decades of deals and congratulations, only to hesitate midair, remembering too late, slowly lowering it with an awkward cough as Ethan simply nodded once, distant, controlled, untouchable, always untouchable, his black gloves pristine, perfectly fitted, as if they were part of him rather than something he chose to wear, and the meeting dissolved into polite applause that never quite reached warmth, because success in Ethan's world never came with connection, only results, only distance, only silence, and as he stepped out into the hallway, the air seemed to shift, employees straightening, conversations dropping, heels and dress shoes quieting instinctively as he passed. A man who had built an empire from nothing, who controlled billions, who could buy entire city blocks with a single decision, and yet who moved through his own company like a ghost no one could touch, not physically, not emotionally, not even by accident. Except accidents had a way of ignoring rules, and 12 floors down, inside a cramped HR office that still smelled faintly of printer ink and burnt coffee, Maya Brooks adjusted the strap of her bag, rereading the orientation packet for the 3rd time, her name freshly printed under the title, Executive Assistant to the CEO, a position people whispered about like it came with an expiration date, high turnover, impossible standards, and one unspoken warning highlighted in every sideways glance she'd received since walking in. Don't get too close. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she felt it, the tension woven into every polite smile, every too quick explanation, every sentence that stopped just short of saying something important. And when the HR manager finally handed her the last form and said, "You'll meet Mr. Cole shortly," there was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long, as if something else wanted to be said but wasn't allowed. Maya nodded anyway, steady, observant, the kind of person who noticed what people didn't say more than what they did. And when she stepped into the private elevator reserved only for the top floor, the doors closing with a soft click, she caught her reflection in the brushed steel panel, straight posture, calm eyes. Nothing remarkable on the surface, but something quietly unshaken underneath. Something that didn't shrink in unfamiliar spaces. And as the elevator began its ascent, smooth and silent, she didn't know she was rising into a world built entirely on control, on distance, on a rule that had held for 20 years without exception, until the moment the lights flickered, just once, subtle but enough to break the illusion of perfection. And somewhere above, on the 42nd floor, Ethan paused mid-step, his gloved hand hovering near the edge of his desk, as if he had felt something shift before it even happened, as if the system he had perfected was about to be interrupted, because for the first time in 2 decades, someone was about to step into his world who didn't know the rules, and more dangerously, wasn't afraid of breaking them. The elevator climbed in perfect silence, each passing floor marked only by a soft digital chime, and Maya Brooks stood still with her hands lightly clasped in front of her, feeling the subtle hum beneath her feet as the city dropped farther away below her, the weight of the building shifting into something quieter, more controlled, more distant, until even the air inside the elevator felt different, cooler, like it belonged to someone who preferred precision over warmth. And when the doors finally opened onto the 42nd floor, she stepped out into a corridor that looked less like an office and more like a private world, where every surface reflected intention, where glass and steel met in clean lines, and where even the faintest sound seemed to disappear before it could echo. A receptionist greeted her with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, already aware of who she was, already measuring her in a way that Maya had learned to recognize, not unkind, but cautious, as if she were walking into something that required careful handling. "Mr. Cole is expecting you," the receptionist said, her voice lower than necessary, as though the walls themselves were listening, and Maya nodded, taking the final steps down the hallway, her heels making the softest contact with the floor, until she reached a door that was slightly ajar, not wide open, not closed, just enough to suggest invitation without warmth, and she knocked gently before pushing it open, stepping into a space that was larger than she expected, but emptier, too. A desk positioned with exact symmetry, shelves lined with perfectly spaced files, a city view stretching wide behind it all, and at the center of it stood Ethan Cole, facing the window with his back to her, still, composed, his posture straight in a way that did not relax even when no one was watching. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice steady, professional, and he turned slowly, not startled, not rushed, just deliberate, his eyes landing on her with a quiet intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment, as if he were reading something invisible in the space between them. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, before he spoke. "You are early," his voice calm, even, with no trace of greeting or disapproval, simply a statement of fact, and Maya allowed a small, polite nod. "I prefer to be," she replied, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough to register as a slight recalibration, as though he had expected something else, something less composed, less certain, and he gestured toward the desk with a subtle motion of his gloved hand. "Your responsibilities are outlined in the file on the table," he said, already turning slightly away, already creating distance. "You will manage scheduling, communications, and anything that requires efficiency." The word lingered, precise, intentional, and Maya stepped forward, her focus on the folder, her movements controlled, respectful of the space, and as she reached for the file, her fingers brushed the edge of the desk at the exact moment Ethan shifted his position, the distance between them narrowing by accident, by inches, by timing that no one had planned. And then it happened, small, almost nothing, the lightest contact as her hand grazed the side of his wrist, a moment so brief it could have been imagined. But it was not, because Ethan froze, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, his entire body stilling as if the world had paused around that single point of contact, his breath catching just slightly, his eyes sharpening in a way that was not anger, not exactly, but something closer to alarm, something reflexive, something that had been trained into him over years, and Maya felt it instantly, the shift in the air, the invisible line she had crossed without knowing it existed, and she pulled her hand back immediately, not in panic, but in awareness, her expression calm, her voice quiet. "I am sorry," she said, not overly apologetic, not defensive, simply acknowledging what had happened, and Ethan stepped back, a single, measured step, creating space again, restoring the distance that seemed to matter more than anything else in the room, his jaw tightening just slightly before smoothing out, control returning in layers, piece by piece. "Do not do that again," he said, the words firm but not raised, and Maya met his gaze without challenge, without fear, just understanding. "Understood," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that did not carry embarrassment or curiosity, no lingering question, no attempt to fill the silence with explanation, just acceptance, and that, more than the contact itself, was what lingered, because as Ethan turned away again, as he resumed his position by the window, as the room settled back into its controlled stillness, there was a subtle disruption that had already taken place, not visible in the arrangement of the desk or the lines of the skyline, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, in the space between two people who now stood on opposite sides of a rule that had just been broken for the first time in 20 years, and neither of them said another word, but the silence no longer felt the same. By the second morning, the entire 42nd floor had already adjusted itself around Maya Brooks without a single instruction being spoken, as if the building itself had decided to watch her closely, waiting to see how long she would last, because no one survived long in that office without learning the invisible rules. And yet Maya moved through the space differently, not slower, not faster, just with a quiet awareness that made people pause without knowing why. She did not hover near Ethan's office door. She did not ask unnecessary questions. And most importantly, she did not try to fix what she did not understand. Instead, she observed. And what she saw was a pattern so precise it almost felt engineered. Ethan Cole arrived at exactly 7:45 every morning. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later, his footsteps measured. His presence announced only by the subtle shift in the atmosphere as conversations lowered and screens suddenly became more important. He never carried anything in his hands except his phone, never allowed anyone to pass him documents directly. Everything was placed on his desk before he entered or left after he exited. Coffee appeared exactly 3 inches from the right edge of his desk, always black, always untouched for the first 20 minutes, as if he needed the routine more than the drink itself. Meetings were scheduled with exact spacing, never back-to-back, always with a 5-minute gap that no one dared fill, and through it all, the most consistent detail was the distance. No one stepped too close, no one leaned in, no one reached out. It was not written, but it was followed, like gravity, like something natural and absolute, and Maya noticed every part of it, not with judgment, but with understanding, because patterns like that did not come from preference. They came from something deeper, something learned, something protected. And so she adjusted, quietly, precisely. She placed documents before he arrived, aligned them exactly the way he seemed to prefer. She scheduled meetings with the same 5-minute gaps. She set his coffee down without waiting for acknowledgement. And when she spoke, she kept her voice calm, steady, never forcing interaction, never closing the distance. And at first, Ethan did not react at all, not visibly, not outwardly. But there were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when his attention lingered just a second longer than necessary, when his eyes flicked toward her movements, as if recalculating something, because unlike everyone else, Maya was not avoiding him out of fear. She was respecting the space without making it feel like a barrier, and that difference, subtle as it was, began to shift the rhythm of the room. On the third day, during a late afternoon meeting that stretched longer than expected, the tension in the room built slowly, not from conflict, but from exhaustion. Numbers discussed, projections debated, voices controlled but strained, and when one of the executives began speaking faster, louder, stepping closer without realizing it, the room reacted before Ethan did. Shoulders stiffened, eyes flicked, a silent warning passed between them. But it was too late. The distance had been broken, and Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table. Not dramatic, not obvious, but enough for Maya to see it from across the room. Enough for her to understand that the control he maintained was not effortless. It was constant, and, without interrupting, without drawing attention, she stepped forward just enough to redirect the flow, sliding a document across the table in a way that shifted the executive's position back by inches, restoring the space without a word. And the moment passed. The meeting continued. No one acknowledged what had just happened, but Ethan did, his gaze lifting briefly, meeting hers for a fraction of a second, something unspoken settling there before he looked away again. And when the room finally emptied, when the last voice faded and the door closed softly behind them, the silence returned, familiar, controlled, but not exactly the same. Maya gathered the remaining papers, placing them neatly in a stack, her movements unhurried. And as she turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her. "You noticed," he said, not a question, not quite. And she paused, looking back at him. "Yes," she answered simply. And there was no elaboration, no attempt to explain what she had seen or why she had acted. Just honesty, direct and quiet. And Ethan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, as if weighing something he had not expected to consider, before he spoke again. "Most people pretend not to." And Maya allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Most people are afraid to," she replied, and the words settled between them. Not heavy, not confrontational, just true. And for the first time since she had walked into that office, Ethan did not immediately turn away, did not re-establish distance with movement. Instead, he remained still, as if the space between them no longer needed to be measured in feet and inches, but in something else entirely, something quieter, something that neither of them named. And then, just as quickly, the moment shifted, the routine returning, the structure reasserting itself, but not completely, not perfectly, because somewhere beneath the precision, beneath the rules that had held for 20 years, a small change had already begun, and neither of them could undo it. The first time Ethan Cole noticed the absence, it was not dramatic, not immediate, but it lingered in the kind of silence that only existed when something precise had shifted out of place. Because at exactly 7:45 that morning, when he stepped into his office, the desk was as perfect as always, the skyline unchanged, the air still controlled, but the coffee was already there, placed exactly 3 inches from the edge, steam rising faintly in the cool room. And for a brief second, he paused, not because the action itself was new, but because the timing was, because no one had ever anticipated his arrival so accurately without being told. And he moved forward, setting his phone down in its usual position, his gloved fingers adjusting the angle by instinct, before his gaze shifted toward the doorway where Maya stood just outside, not waiting for acknowledgement, not hovering, simply present in the background of the room, like she understood the difference between assistance and intrusion. And when he reached for the coffee, there was a fraction of hesitation, barely visible, as if the act of taking something she had prepared carried a weight he was not used to considering. But he took it anyway, lifting the cup with the same controlled movement he applied to everything else. And for the first time in a long time, the routine felt slightly unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, but different. And throughout the morning, that difference followed him in small, quiet ways. Documents appeared exactly when needed, not early, not late. Emails were filtered with a precision that matched his own expectations. Meetings flowed without friction, transitions smoother than before, and yet none of it drew attention to itself, because Maya did not seek recognition. She simply adjusted the system around him until it worked better without asking permission. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him, because control had always belonged entirely to him. And now, without effort, without confrontation, someone else was beginning to share it, not by taking it, but by understanding it. And by midday, the realization had settled into something he could not ignore. And during a brief pause between meetings, as the office emptied into a rare quiet, Ethan stood by the window, the city stretching below him in ordered chaos, his reflection faint against the glass. And for a moment, his gaze dropped, not to the skyline, but to his own hands, still covered, still protected, the black gloves as constant as they had been for years. And there was a memory there, not fully formed, not clear, but present enough to tighten something in his chest, something he did not allow himself to revisit. And behind him, the door opened softly, not abruptly, not carelessly, just enough to signal presence without disruption. Your 1 o'clock has been moved to 1:15, Maya said, her voice steady, controlled, and he nodded without turning. Why? He asked, and she stepped just inside the room, maintaining the same measured distance she had kept since the first day. He was running late, she replied, and you had not taken a break. The statement simple, factual, but it carried an awareness that extended beyond scheduling, and Ethan turned slightly, his eyes settling on her with a quiet intensity. I do not require breaks, he said, and Maya did not challenge him, did not correct him. She simply met his gaze for a moment before answering. That may be true, but you perform better when you take them. And the words landed differently than expected, not as defiance, not as instruction, but as observation. And for a second, the silence stretched again, not tense, not uncomfortable, just present. And then Ethan looked away, returning his attention to the city. 5 minutes, he said, the concession small, almost insignificant, but in a world defined by control, it was not nothing. And Maya gave a slight nod, stepping back toward the door without another word, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. And as the door closed behind her, the space shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for Ethan to notice, enough for him to stand there a moment longer than he usually would, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his thoughts not on the meeting ahead, not on the numbers or the decisions waiting for him, but on something far less measurable, something that did not fit neatly into the structure he had built, because for the first time in 20 years, the rules he had followed without question were no longer absolute. They were being adjusted, not broken, not forced, but quietly rewritten, one small moment at a time, and somewhere in that shift, something he had long buried began to surface, not as a memory he could see, but as a feeling he could not ignore, and he did not know yet whether that change was a risk or something else entirely. But he knew one thing with certainty. It had started the moment she walked into his office, and it was not going to stop on its own. The first real mistake did not come from carelessness. It came from instinct, and that was what made it impossible for Ethan Cole to ignore, because by the end of the week, the system he had built around himself was no longer something he controlled alone. It was something Maya Brooks had begun to anticipate before it even happened. And that morning, when a last-minute schedule change rippled through the office, shifting meetings, compressing time, forcing decisions to be made faster than usual, the tension returned in subtle ways, sharper voices, tighter movements, the quiet precision of the 42nd floor beginning to crack under pressure, and Ethan moved through it all with his usual control, adjusting, recalculating, maintaining distance, always distance, until the unexpected interruption came. A call that required immediate attention, urgent but not chaotic, the kind of situation he handled daily without hesitation. And as he stepped out of his office, already focused, already ahead of the problem, he reached for the file that should have been placed on the side table outside his door, but it was not there, and for the briefest moment, something in his expression hardened, not frustration, but disruption, because the pattern had been broken, and before he could turn back, before he could call for it, Maya appeared from the opposite direction, the folder already in her hand, her timing exact, her steps measured, and she extended the document toward him without thinking. Without the careful adjustment she had practiced all week, because urgency had replaced routine, and in that single moment, the distance between them closed again, not fully, not dramatically, but enough for her hand to come within inches of his, enough for instinct to take over, and this time, Ethan did not step back immediately, his hand moving forward before his mind could stop it, the contact brief but undeniable as his gloved fingers brushed against her skin. And everything stopped, not the office, not the world, but him, completely. As if time had narrowed down to that single point of contact, the sensation sharp in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in years, his breath catching just slightly, his focus breaking in a way that had not happened in a very long time. And Maya saw it, not with shock, not with fear, but with clarity, because this time, the reaction was different, not immediate retreat, not cold rejection, but hesitation, something softer, something uncertain, and she did not pull away abruptly, did not react in a way that would amplify the moment. She simply held still for half a second longer than necessary, allowing him the space to choose. And that was what made the difference, because Ethan realized, in that quiet fraction of time, that he had not pulled back yet, that the distance he had maintained for 20 years had not reasserted itself automatically, and the realization hit him deeper than the contact itself, because it meant something had changed, something he had not planned, something he did not fully understand. And then, just as quickly, control returned, his hand withdrawing, the space between them restored, the moment sealed behind the same composed expression he always wore. But it was not the same, not anymore, and Maya handed him the file without another word, her voice steady, unaffected. "You will need page 3, she said, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not shifted in the space of a second, and Ethan took the document, his grip firm, his posture straight. But his focus was no longer entirely on the task in front of him, because as he turned and walked toward the conference room, the feeling lingered, not on his skin, not through the glove, but somewhere deeper, somewhere he had spent years keeping silent. And throughout the meeting that followed, his attention fractured in ways no one else could see, his responses still precise, his decisions still sharp, but underneath it all, there was a question he could not ignore, a disruption that would not settle back into place. And when the meeting finally ended, when the room emptied once again, leaving him alone with the quiet he had always relied on, he stood still for a moment longer than usual, the file still in his hand, his gaze unfocused, not on the numbers, not on the outcome, but on something far less tangible, and For the first time in 20 years, Ethan Cole questioned not the world around him, but the rules he had built to survive it, because they had just been broken, not by force, not by accident, but by something as simple and as complicated as a single touch he had not pulled away from in time. The change did not announce itself loudly. It did not disrupt the structure of the office or the rhythm of the day, but it settled into the space between Ethan and Maya in a way that could not be undone, because after that moment, after the brief contact he had not pulled away from in time, something in Ethan Cole's behavior shifted in ways so subtle that no one else would have noticed, except Maya did, and she did not react to it. She simply adjusted again, because the next morning, when she placed the documents on his desk, she did not retreat immediately. She allowed herself to remain in the room a second longer than before, not close, never close, but present. And when Ethan entered at exactly 7:45, his eyes moved across the room in the same precise pattern they always did: desk, skyline, alignment, and then to her. And this time, instead of dismissing her presence as part of the environment, his attention lingered just slightly, enough to acknowledge, enough to recognize, and then he moved forward, the routine continuing, but not untouched, not entirely controlled, because as he reached for the documents, there was a moment, barely noticeable, where his hand paused just above the surface, as if measuring the space again, as if recalculating something that no longer followed the same rules. And Maya did not move, did not shift. She simply waited, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. And Ethan took the file, his movement steady, but the awareness remained, and throughout the day, that awareness followed him, not distracting, not overwhelming, but present in every interaction, every transition, every pause between tasks, because for the first time, he was not only managing the external order of his world, he was aware of something internal shifting beneath it, something that did not respond to logic or structure, and by the afternoon, that shift became impossible to ignore, because during a quiet moment between meetings, as Maya stood by the side table organizing the next set of documents, Ethan spoke without planning to, without preparing the words the way he usually did. "Why did you not pull away?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with authority. And Maya looked up, not surprised, not caught off guard, as if she had expected the question at some point, even if she did not know when it would come. And she answered simply, "Because you did not." And the response settled into the room with a clarity that made further explanation unnecessary, because it was not defiance, it was not curiosity, it was observation. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, his expression unreadable, but his mind moving through something far less structured than the decisions he made every day, because her answer had not challenged him, it had reflected him. And that was something he was not used to, not in business, not in life, not in the carefully controlled environment he had built around himself. And he turned away after a second, returning to the desk, but the question did not end there. It expanded, not outwardly, but internally, because if she had not pulled away because he had not, then the responsibility for that moment did not belong to her. It belonged to him. And that realization carried a weight he had not expected to feel. And the rest of the afternoon passed with the same precision as always. Meetings concluded, decisions made, schedules maintained, but underneath it all, the structure was no longer absolute. It had a variable now, something unpredictable, something human. And as the office began to quiet in the early evening, as the last of the employees gathered their things, and the hum of activity faded into silence, Maya finished organizing the final documents for the next day, placing them exactly where they would be needed, her movements calm, consistent. And when she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because behind her, Ethan had not moved, had not returned to his usual pattern of immediate dismissal once the work was complete. Instead, he stood by the desk, his hands resting lightly against the surface, his posture still controlled, but his focus no longer entirely on the tasks ahead. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching into something that felt less like distance and more like space, something that could be crossed, but did not need to be forced. And then Maya stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Ethan alone with a room that no longer felt entirely the same, because the rules he had followed for 20 years were still there, still present, but no longer unchallenged. And as he stood there, looking down at his gloved hands, he realized that the question was no longer whether the rules would hold, but how long it would take before he stopped needing them at all. The memory did not return all at once. It never did. It came in fragments, quiet and uninvited, triggered not by sound or sight, but by something far less predictable, something Ethan Cole had spent 20 years avoiding. And that evening, as the office emptied and the city outside shifted into the soft glow of dusk, he remained standing in the same place long after he should have left, his reflection faint in the glass, his hands still covered, still protected, but no longer untouched by awareness, because for the first time in years, he could not ignore the past pressing just beneath the surface, not as a clear image, but as a feeling that refused to stay buried. And it began with something simple, the absence of movement, the absence of distance, the realization that he had not stepped back when he should have. And from that single point, the memory unfolded, not fully, not completely, but enough to disrupt the silence he relied on, enough to remind him of a different time, a different version of himself, one who had not measured every interaction, one who had not built walls out of routine and control, one who had not needed gloves to separate himself from the world. And the shift between those versions was not sudden. It was gradual, shaped by a moment he had never allowed himself to revisit, a moment that had changed everything without warning. And as he stood there, his mind pulled him back, not into clarity, but into sensation, the weight of responsibility, the sharp realization that something had gone wrong, the silence that followed, heavier than anything he had ever experienced, and then nothing, because that was where he always stopped. That was where he had trained himself to stop, before the details could form, before the memory could take shape, because some things were easier to control when they remained incomplete, and for 20 years, that had been enough. But now, it was not, because the present no longer allowed him to maintain that distance, because Maya Brooks had stepped into his world without breaking it, without forcing it, but by simply existing within it in a way that made avoidance impossible. And the next morning, the shift carried over into something tangible, because when Ethan arrived, the routine was already in motion, the desk prepared, the schedule aligned, everything exactly as it should be. And yet when Maya stepped into the room to confirm the first meeting of the day, there was a pause, not in her movement, not in her voice, but in the space between them, because Ethan did not immediately turn away, did not retreat into the structure he had always relied on. Instead, he remained where he was, his gaze steady, his posture controlled, but his attention fully present. And for the first time, the silence between them did not feel like a barrier. It felt like something waiting to be understood, and Maya noticed it. Of course she did. But she did not react. She did not fill the space with unnecessary words. She simply stood there, meeting his gaze with the same calm awareness she had shown since the beginning. And after a moment, Ethan spoke, not with authority, not with instruction, but with something quieter, something closer to honesty than he had allowed himself in years. "You do not ask questions," he said, and Maya considered that for a second before answering. "Only when they are needed." And the response was not defensive, not distant, just true. And Ethan studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to understand the difference between curiosity and restraint, between intrusion and presence. And then he looked down, his attention shifting briefly to his hands, still covered, still part of the routine he had built, but no longer untouched by doubt. And for a moment, the room felt smaller, not physically, but emotionally, as if the space he had created to protect himself was beginning to close in. And without thinking, without planning, he reached up and removed one glove, slowly, deliberately, the motion controlled but carrying a weight that neither of them acknowledged out loud. And when his bare hand rested against the edge of the desk, the absence of the barrier felt louder than any sound in the room. Because it was not just a physical change, it was a decision, a step that could not be undone once taken. And Maya did not move, did not react. She simply observed, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, allowing him to take that step without pressure, without expectation. And Ethan kept his hand there for a moment, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable, as if testing the reality of it, as if proving to himself that he could exist in that space without retreating. And then, just as quietly, he placed the glove on the desk beside him, not discarded, not abandoned, but no longer in use. And when he finally looked back at Maya, there was something different in his gaze, not fully open, not fully understood, but no longer entirely closed. And, for the first time in 20 years, the distance between them was no longer defined by fear, but by choice, and that made all the difference. The absence of the glove did not go unnoticed, not by the office, not by the quiet system that had been built around Ethan Cole for years, because even the smallest deviation in his routine carried weight, and by mid-morning, the shift had already begun to ripple outward, subtle glances exchanged between employees, a hesitation in movement, an unspoken awareness that something was different on the 42nd floor, and yet no one dared to acknowledge it directly, because whatever had changed was happening within a space that had always been untouchable, and inside that space, Maya Brooks continued her work exactly as she always had, precise, calm, unaffected by the tension that lingered just beneath the surface, because for her, the change was not something to react to, it was something to respect, and as the day unfolded, the difference became more defined, not through dramatic actions, but through the absence of avoidance. Because when Maya entered the office to review the next set of meetings, Ethan did not immediately turn away, did not create distance with movement. Instead, he remained where he was, one hand bare against the desk, the other still covered, as if he had not yet decided which version of himself he was willing to be, and the contrast was visible, not only in the physical sense, but in the way he held himself, slightly less rigid, slightly less controlled. As if the act of removing the glove had done more than change his appearance, it had altered something deeper, something internal, and Maya stepped forward just enough to place the updated schedule on the desk, her movements measured, her presence steady. And for a brief moment, the distance between them existed without tension, without the sharp awareness that had defined every interaction before, because this time, the space was not being enforced, it was being chosen. And Ethan watched her hand as she set the papers down, his focus not on the documents, but on the simplicity of the action, on the absence of fear or hesitation. And when she withdrew, he did not move immediately. He allowed the moment to remain, to settle, as if testing whether the silence could exist without the protection he had relied on for so long. And it did. It held, quiet and steady, and that realization carried a weight he could not ignore, because it meant that the rules he had built were no longer necessary in the same way they once had been, and that possibility was both unfamiliar and unsettling. And by the afternoon, that tension found its way into something more tangible, because during a high-level meeting with external partners, the usual structure began to shift, not in a way that disrupted the discussion, but in a way that challenged the expectations that had always surrounded Ethan. Because as the meeting concluded, one of the partners, unaware of the unspoken rules or perhaps choosing to ignore them, extended his hand with a confident smile, expecting the standard gesture that closed deals and confirmed agreements. And for a brief moment, the room held its breath, the silence tightening, every person present aware of what would normally happen next, the subtle avoidance, the controlled nod, the distance maintained. But this time, Ethan did not step back immediately. He did not dismiss the gesture without acknowledgement. Instead, he looked at the offered hand, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, and something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. Because for the first time in 20 years, the decision was not automatic, it was conscious, and that difference mattered, and the room remained still, waiting, as Ethan slowly extended his own hand, the bare one, the one no one had seen uncovered before. And for a second, just a second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was not just a gesture, it was a choice. And then he completed it, his hand meeting the other man's in a firm, controlled handshake, brief but undeniable. And the impact of that moment was immediate, not in sound or reaction, but in the shift that followed, because the room exhaled, the tension releasing in a way no one could fully explain. And Ethan withdrew his hand just as quickly, the movement precise, controlled, but different, undeniably different. And as the meeting ended and the room began to clear, the change lingered, not only in the perception of those who had witnessed it, but within Ethan himself, because as he stood there, his hands still bare, he realized that the boundary he had maintained for 2 decades had just been crossed, not by accident, not by force, but by his own decision, and that realization settled into something he could not ignore, something that would not return to silence. And when he stepped back into his office, closing the door behind him, the space felt unfamiliar in a way he could not fully define, because for the first time, it was not entirely controlled, not entirely protected. And as he looked toward the desk where his glove still rested, untouched, he understood that the change he had begun was no longer something he could reverse, because it had already moved beyond a single moment. It had become something real, something that would continue, whether he was ready for it or not. The moment should have ended in the boardroom, contained within the brief contact of a handshake and the quiet shift it created, but it did not, because change, once it begins, does not stay where it started. It moves, it spreads, it forces its way into places that were once sealed. And by the time Ethan stepped back into his office, closing the door with the same controlled motion he had practiced for years, the silence that greeted him felt different, not because the room had changed, but because he had, and that difference made everything else impossible to ignore, because his hand, still uncovered, still unprotected, carried a presence he could not dismiss, not as sensation, but as awareness, as if the absence of the barrier had exposed something deeper than skin, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. And he stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, his gaze shifting from the skyline to the desk, to the glove resting where he had left it, untouched, waiting, as if it still belonged to him, as if nothing had changed. But it had, and the realization settled into something heavier than hesitation, because the control he had relied on was no longer absolute. It had been interrupted, not by force, not by failure, but by choice, his own choice, and that made it impossible to dismiss, because control lost by accident could be restored, but control given up willingly could not be reclaimed in the same way. And as he moved toward the desk, his steps measured but slower than usual, his hand hovering just above the glove without picking it up, there was a flicker of memory, not clear, not complete, but present enough to stop him, a fragment of a moment he had spent years avoiding, the echo of a voice, the weight of responsibility, the stillness that followed, and then nothing again, because that was where it always ended, where he forced it to end. But now, the silence that followed did not feel protective, it felt incomplete, and before he could push the thought away, the door opened softly behind him, the sound quiet but enough to break the moment, and Maya stepped inside. Not abruptly, not intrusively, just as she always did, carrying a tablet with the updated schedule, her presence steady, unaffected by the shift that had just taken place, because for her, the moment in the boardroom was not something to react to. It was something to acknowledge without making it larger than it needed to be, and she spoke in the same calm tone. "Your 6 o'clock has been confirmed," she said, placing the tablet on the desk with the same precise movement she had practiced since her first day, and Ethan turned slightly, his attention shifting from the glove to her, his expression controlled, but his focus no longer entirely guarded, because now, when he looked at her, he was not only seeing his assistant, he was seeing the point where his control had changed, the person who had stepped into his world without breaking it, and that awareness made the distance between them feel different, not smaller, but more defined, as if it was no longer something he had to maintain, but something he could choose, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them in a way that was no longer empty. And then Ethan broke it, not with authority, not with instruction, but with something quieter, something uncertain. "It was unnecessary," he said. And Maya looked at him, her expression steady. "The handshake," he added, clarifying, as if the words needed to be anchored in something specific, and she considered that for a second before responding. "It was expected," she replied, and the answer was simple, direct, but it carried a meaning that extended beyond the situation, because expectation and necessity were not the same, and Ethan understood that, which was why he did not respond immediately, because the truth was not in whether the gesture had been required, but in why he had chosen to do it. And that was a question he was not prepared to answer, not out loud, not yet. And Maya, did not push, did not fill the silence with interpretation. She simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist without pressure, and after a second, she turned slightly, preparing to leave, but before she reached the door, Ethan spoke again, the words quieter this time, less certain. "Did you expect me to?" he asked, and Maya paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, considering the question not as something to answer quickly, but as something to understand, and then she turned back, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity she had shown from the beginning. "No," she said, and the honesty of the response settled into the room with a weight that neither of them could ignore, because it meant that what had happened was not part of a pattern, not part of an expectation. It was something new, something unplanned, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, but his thoughts no longer entirely controlled, because if she had not expected it, then the change did not come from her, it came from him, and that realization carried more weight than anything else, because it meant that the barrier he had relied on for 20 years had not been broken by circumstance, it had been lowered by choice. And as Maya stepped out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, the silence returned once again, but it was no longer the same silence he had known for years. It was something else, something that carried the echo of what had changed and the uncertainty of what would come next. And as Ethan stood there, his hand still bare, the glove still untouched, he realized that the question was no longer whether he could return to the way things were, but whether he even wanted to. The fracture did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, quietly, the way something breaks when it has been held together for too long, because the following day, the office did not feel like a system anymore. It felt like something watching him, waiting for him to decide what version of himself would walk through the door at 7:45. And when Ethan Cole stepped inside, the precision was still there, the desk aligned, the skyline unchanged, the schedule prepared, but the balance was not. Because now there was a question in every movement, in every pause, in every decision he made. And that question followed him from the moment he set his phone down to the second his gaze landed on Maya Brooks standing just outside the room, her posture calm, her presence steady, not waiting, not pushing, simply existing in the space without altering it. And that was what made it harder, because she did not demand change, she allowed it. And that left the choice entirely in his hands. And for the first time in years, that choice did not feel like control, it felt like risk. And as the morning progressed, the tension grew, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could define, but internally, because the memory that had been pushing at the edges of his awareness the night before did not fade. It sharpened, not into clear images, but into something closer to truth, something he could no longer avoid by leaving it incomplete. And during a brief pause between meetings, when the office fell into a rare silence, he found himself standing at the desk again, his bare hand resting against the surface, his other hand still covered, the contrast now impossible to ignore. And without thinking, without planning, he reached for the second glove, his fingers brushing against the edge of it. And for a moment, the instinct to put it back on returned, familiar, automatic, the same reflex that had guided him for 20 years. But this time, it hesitated, it faltered, because the reason behind it no longer felt as absolute as it once had. And before he could complete the motion, the memory broke through, not as a fragment, not as a sensation, but as something clearer than it had ever been before, a moment frozen in time, a conversation unfinished, a presence that had once been close enough to reach, close enough to hold, and then gone, not violently, not dramatically, but in a way that left silence behind, a silence that had shaped everything that followed. And Ethan's hand stopped completely, the glove still between his fingers, as the realization settled into something undeniable. Because the distance he had created had not been about protection. It had been about avoidance, about never having to feel that absence again, about never allowing himself to stand in a moment where something could be lost. And for years, that had been enough. It had kept everything in place, controlled, predictable, safe. But now, standing in that office, with the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, it no longer felt like safety. It felt like limitation. And the difference between those two things was something he could not ignore anymore. And behind him, the door opened softly, the sound familiar, expected, and Maya stepped inside with the same quiet presence she always carried, her movements measured, her expression calm. But this time, she did not speak immediately, because something in the room had shifted, something deeper than routine, something that made even the silence feel heavier, and Ethan did not turn right away, his focus still on the glove in his hand, the decision still unfinished, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them holding something that did not need to be explained. And then Maya spoke, her voice softer than usual, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. "You do not have to decide today," she said, and the words landed in a way that cut through the tension without breaking it, because they did not demand action. They did not push him forward or pull him back, they simply allowed him to exist in the moment without forcing it into something it was not ready to become. And Ethan closed his hand slightly, the glove still there, but no longer something he needed to hold on to, and he set it back down on the desk, not as a rejection, not as a final decision, but as a pause, a choice to not return immediately to what had been. And when he finally turned to face her, his expression was not entirely controlled, not entirely guarded. There was something else there now, something uncertain, something real, and for the first time, the distance between them did not feel like a boundary. It felt like something that could be crossed, not by accident, not by force, but by intention, and neither of them moved to close it, because they both understood that the moment was not about reaching, it was about choosing. And as the silence settled once again, it carried a different weight than before, not empty, not protective, but open, and that was something Ethan Cole had not allowed himself to feel in 20 years, until now. The moment did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived in silence, in the kind of stillness that only exists when something important is about to change. And that morning, as the city stretched wide beneath the glass and the office settled into its familiar rhythm, Ethan Cole stood in the center of his world with a clarity he had not felt in years, because the question was no longer distant. It was no longer something he could delay or avoid. It was here, present, waiting, and for the first time, he did not try to control it. He allowed it to exist, and that alone shifted everything. Because when Maya Brooks stepped into the room with the morning schedule, her presence, calm, steady, unchanged, the space between them felt different, not because it had grown smaller, but because it was no longer defined by fear. It was defined by possibility, and Ethan turned toward her without hesitation, his posture still composed, but his attention fully present, not divided, not guarded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling into something that felt less like distance and more like understanding. And then Ethan moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately, stepping forward just enough to close the space by a fraction, not enough to overwhelm, not enough to force, just enough to change the dynamic that had existed between them since the beginning. And Maya did not step back, did not adjust to restore the distance. She remained where she was, her expression calm, her presence steady, allowing him to take that step without resistance. And that was what made it possible. Because the moment was not built on pressure, it was built on trust. And Ethan stopped there, the space between them now different, no longer rigid, no longer absolute. And for a second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was not about breaking a rule anymore. It was about choosing something new, something he had spent 20 years avoiding. And his hand lifted slowly, the movement controlled but carrying a weight that neither of them acknowledged out loud, because they both understood what it meant, not just physically, but emotionally. And Maya watched the motion without reaction, without expectation, her focus steady, her presence grounded, giving him the space to complete the decision on his own terms. And for a moment, his hand hovered there, not touching, not retreating, existing in the space between intention and action. And then, finally, he closed the distance, his fingers gently brushing against her hand, not by accident, not by necessity, but by choice. And the contact was different this time, not sharp, not disruptive, but steady, intentional, real. And Ethan did not pull away. He did not retreat into the control he had relied on for so long. Instead, he allowed the moment to exist, his hand remaining there, the connection simple, quiet, but undeniable. And something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough enough for Maya to see it. Enough for her to understand that this was not just a physical change. It was something deeper, something that had taken years to reach, and she did not react with surprise or relief. She simply met the moment with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning, her hand steady, her expression soft but composed, as if she had always known that this would happen eventually, not because she had caused it, but because he had chosen it. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had led to this point, every moment of restraint, every shift in awareness, every quiet decision that had brought him here. And after a few seconds, Ethan withdrew his hand, not abruptly, not as a retreat, but as a completion. The gesture finished, the boundary crossed, and he looked at her, really looked at her, not as part of the system, not as something to manage, but as the person who had stood in front of him without breaking his world. And for the first time, his voice carried something that had nothing to do with control. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but they held a weight that went beyond the moment, beyond the office, beyond everything he had built around himself. And Maya gave a small nod, not dismissing the significance, but not amplifying it either, because she understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. And as she turned to place the schedule on the desk, the room settled into a new kind of quiet, one that no longer relied on distance to exist. And as Ethan stood there, his hand no longer hidden, his choice no longer unmade, he realized that the life he had built had not been broken, it had been opened, and that was something he had not believed was possible until now. The change did not end with a single moment. It settled into everything that followed, reshaping the rhythm of Ethan Cole's world in ways that could no longer be ignored. Because after that morning, after the first intentional contact that had not been avoided, the distance that had once defined every interaction was no longer a rule. It was a choice, and that difference altered the atmosphere of the entire office, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but undeniable to those who had learned to read the smallest shifts in his behavior. Because now, when Ethan walked through the 42nd floor, the silence that followed him was no longer rigid. It was aware, as if something had changed at the center, and everything else was adjusting to it. And Maya Brooks moved through that space the same way she always had, calm, steady, precise. But now there was a new layer to her presence, not in what she did, but in what she did not need to do anymore, because she no longer had to navigate around an invisible barrier. She simply existed within the same space without altering it. And that simplicity made everything else more real, more immediate. And as the days passed, the shift deepened, not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet consistency. Because Ethan no longer reached for his gloves first thing in the morning, they remained on the desk, untouched, not discarded, but no longer necessary. And the absence of that routine carried more weight than any announcement could have. Because it was not something he declared, it was something he lived, and in the small moments that followed, that change became clearer, in the way he accepted documents directly from Maya, without hesitation, in the way he allowed her to stand closer than anyone else ever had, in the way his attention no longer shifted away the second she entered the room, but remained steady and present, as if he was no longer managing distance, but understanding it. And yet, for all the progress, there was still something unfinished, something that lingered beneath the surface, because change did not erase the past, it revealed it. And one evening, as the office emptied and the city outside softened into twilight, that unfinished piece surfaced in a way that could no longer be avoided, because Maya found it by accident, not while searching, not while looking for answers, but simply by being where she needed to be, organizing the final documents for the next day. When a folder slipped from the stack, falling softly against the floor, the sound quiet, almost insignificant, but enough to draw her attention. And when she bent down to retrieve it, a photograph slid partially out from between the pages, worn at the edges, not part of any official file, not something meant to be there. And for a second, she hesitated, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, because some things were not meant to be seen. And yet, the image was already there, visible enough to register, a younger version of Ethan, not the man defined by control and distance, but someone else, someone who looked less guarded, less contained, standing beside a woman whose expression carried a warmth that did not exist in his current world, and the difference between those two versions was immediate, undeniable, and Maya did not need context to understand that this was not just a memory. It was a turning point, something that had shaped everything that followed, and she carefully slid the photograph back into place, closing the folder without further examination, because understanding did not require intrusion, and just as she set it back on the desk, the door opened quietly behind her, and Ethan stepped inside, his presence filling the room with the same controlled stillness, but this time, there was something else beneath it, something more aware, more open than before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the air holding the unspoken realization between them. Because he had seen the folder, he had seen the way she held it, and he understood, without needing to ask, what she had found, and the silence stretched, not tense, not defensive, but honest, and then Ethan moved forward, not quickly, not urgently, just enough to close part of the space between them, his gaze steady, his posture composed, but his voice quieter than usual. "You should not have seen that," he said, and the words were not accusatory, not sharp. They carried something closer to vulnerability than authority, and Maya met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm. "I was not looking for it," she replied, and the truth in her voice settled into the room with a clarity that required no further explanation, and for a second, Ethan said nothing, his attention shifting briefly to the folder, to the past that had remained hidden for so long, and then back to her. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by what had changed, but by what had yet to be understood, and as the silence settled once again, it carried a different weight, not one of avoidance, but of revelation, because for the first time, the reason behind his distance was no longer entirely his alone, and that changed everything. The silence did not break immediately, it unfolded slowly, the way truth does when it has been held back for too long. And as Ethan Cole stood there, his gaze resting on the folder that had remained closed for years, something in his expression shifted in a way that Maya Brooks had never seen before, not in control, not in distance, but in something far more human, something unguarded, and for a moment, the weight of that change filled the room without a single word being spoken, because what had once been hidden was no longer entirely his to carry alone, and that realization made everything that followed inevitable, because Ethan did not step back this time. He did not retreat into the structure he had relied on for 2 decades. Instead, he moved forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the space between them not out of instinct, but out of choice, and when he reached the desk, his hand rested lightly against its surface, the same place where his gloves had once defined the boundary between himself and everything else, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than it had ever been, not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to assert it. "She believed in me before any of this existed," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond the office, beyond the company, beyond everything he had built since then, and Maya did not interrupt, did not ask for more. She simply listened, her presence steady, her attention focused, allowing him the space to continue in his own time, because this was not something that could be forced, and Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to the skyline before returning to her, as if grounding himself in the present while acknowledging the past he had avoided for so long. "I built everything after she was gone," he continued, his voice even, but no longer distant, "and I told myself it was enough." And there was a pause there, not empty, but filled with the weight of everything that had not been said for years, and Maya understood without needing further explanation, because the absence he had created, the distance he had maintained, was not about the world outside. It was about the space left behind when something meaningful was no longer there, and for a long time, that distance had been his way of controlling that absence, of ensuring that nothing could reach him in the same way again. But now, standing here, with the past no longer hidden and the present no longer untouched, that control no longer held the same purpose, and Ethan's hand moved slightly against the desk, his fingers relaxing in a way that suggested not hesitation, but release, and when he looked at Maya again, there was no barrier left in his expression, no distance to maintain, just clarity, just presence. And in that moment, the choice became simple, not easy, but clear, because the life he had built had protected him from loss, but it had also kept him from everything else, and that was no longer something he was willing to accept. And without another word, he reached out, not slowly this time, not cautiously, but with intention, his hand moving toward hers with a confidence that came not from control, but from understanding. And when their hands met, the contact was steady, grounded, real, not a test, not a moment of uncertainty, but a decision fully made. And Ethan did not pull away. He held that connection, allowing it to exist without fear, without the need to retreat, because for the first time, he was not trying to protect himself from what might be lost. He was allowing himself to experience what was present, and Maya's response was the same as it had always been, calm, steady, without expectation, because she had never been the reason for the change. She had simply been the space where it could happen. And as they stood there, the silence that filled the room was no longer defined by absence. It was defined by something else entirely, something that did not need to be controlled or contained, something that could exist without being measured. And after a moment, Ethan released her hand, not because he needed to, but because the moment had already done what it was meant to do. And as he stepped back, there was no return to the distance that had once defined him, no re-establishment of the barrier he had spent years maintaining, because it was no longer necessary. And when Maya turned to leave, the door closing softly behind her, the room remained quiet, but not in the same way it had before, because now, the silence carried something new, something that extended beyond the office, beyond the routine, beyond everything he had built. And as Ethan stood there, looking out at the city that had once been his entire world, he realized that it no longer defined him the way it used to, because for the first time in 20 years, he was not standing alone within it, and that changed everything.